empty or unaccounted for. That driver was fired, by the way. Well, in light of the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, gun control advocates are asking the government to increase mental health background checks for people trying to purchase firearms. Privacy attorney McKenna joins us with more on the issues that come out of this and such an interesting conversation. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks again for having me.
Well, when you have this issue, obviously no one wants someone who is mentally unstable to possess a firearm. But how do you strike that balance of getting that information and blocking that purchase without stepping over the bounds of their right to privacy?
Right, and the confidentiality of those medical health records. So that is the big issue. And our federal law requires that or prohibits anyone who has a mental illness from owning a firearm. Unfortunately, though, we have something called the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS. The NICS is only as good as the data put into it. And while federal law asks states to supply data for those with mental health issues, and we're not talking about someone on an antidepressant, but something much more serious than that, an involuntary commission to a mental hospital. So when states fail to supply that, and unfortunately over half of our states do not supply mental health records for those with serious mental illnesses to the NICS. So when gun owners are selling a gun, they are required to check the NICS, the background check system. And that system, again, is only as good as the data that's in it. In the case of, privacy rights advocates, it's a curious alignment of folks with mental health advocates and gun control advocates coming together to say we don't want this data recorded. But we see time and time again with horrible, tragic consequences what not having serious mental health records in the NICS does. The Tucson shooting was a substance abuse person who would have been prohibited if the records had been in NICS from purchasing the gun.
Well, what do you have to get into the NICS? I mean, you said just being on an antidepressant isn't enough, but what if someone is mentally ill but has never been arrested?
Right. Well, so the way most state laws are written is to protect the privacy of mental health records. And so when we talk about the federal law and the NICS, they're really looking for things like involuntary commission to a mental hospital or a court record where a court has found. In the case of the horrible Virginia Tech tragedy, that shooter had previously been found to be a danger to himself and others by a judge in the state of Virginia. And yet that record was not in the NICS. If that record had if it had been in the NICS, 32 people at Virginia Tech might not be dead.
All right.
So it's a very difficult balance, but Congress is right now introduced legislation both in the House and Senate to close this loophole, and we have to balance that privacy right. But in the case of where someone is ill enough to be committed involuntarily to a state mental hospital, it should be in the NICS.
All right, Attorney McKenna, as always, thanks for coming in and talking with us today.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.